James Munro. Scottish Saga. Chapter 1. Glenelg, 1817. The threat of eviction loomed over the small Scottish peninsula of Glenelg like a dark, menacing November cloud. It hung over the rocks of the Falcon Ridge, casting a long, ominous shadow along the Glenmore Valley, touching poor tenants and farmers, tax collectors and landlords alike. In his small, rough-hewn stone cottage, Angus Ross, a subtenant of Hugh McCrimmon, knew he would be among the first to feel the impact of the gathering storm. A father of 7 surviving children, Angus and his prematurely aged wife Elsa had already laid 4 others to rest in the tiny Glenelg cemetery. The Ross family had little left to lose from the eviction, yet it would fall entirely upon their shoulders. Moreover, eviction also threatened Hugh McCrimmon himself. A tax collector, full tenant, and distant relative of the Glenelg clan chief, McCrimmon grazed a herd of black, half-wild cattle on the mountain slopes above the river that ran through Glenmore. Yet, he had enough spare land to lease to equally half-wild Highlanders. McCrimmon's greatest passion was the bagpipes, the magnificent war pipes of the Scottish Highlands. He played melodies that the McCrimmons had performed for centuries among the mountains and narrow glens of Glenelg. Hugh McCrimmon was recognised as the finest piper ever known in the remote lands of northern Scotland. When Charles Cameron of Glenelg raised a regiment to fight in the Peninsular Wars, he chose Hugh McCrimmon as his chief piper. Together, they became part of the Duke of Wellington's victorious army, marching through Portugal and Spain to the Pyrenees, and ultimately facing Napoleon Bonaparte on his own soil. On the hills beyond Toulouse, a sharpshooter's musket ball struck down McCrimmon, the chief piper, as he played the advance for the Glenelg regiment. Leaning against the broken wheel of an abandoned wagon, Hugh McCrimmon continued to play the stirring music of the Scottish Highlands, waving after the men as they marched into battle and offering words of comfort as they returned, bloodied but victorious. Angus Ross was among those who suffered most in the Battle of Toulouse. A cannonball left little work for the surgeon. By the time the battle had ended, Angus Ross's arm lay among the grim contents of a wooden tub, carried out from a church that had been temporarily turned into an operating room. That hard-won victory had taken place 3 years ago, in 1814. Now, a new battle loomed, the fight against the spectre of eviction. If that spectre took shape in reality, even Cameron of Glenelg, who lived in his fine house on the green slope of Rattigan in the eastern part of the Glenelg Peninsula, would not be spared. Yet the landowner himself remained unaware of the approaching danger. Cameron of Glenelg looked down upon tax collectors and tenants alike, but his gaze was not turned toward the heavens. This was not the same Cameron of Glenelg who had led his regiment to Toulouse. The brave Charles Cameron had fallen to a bullet on the very day that brought victory. Angus Ross and Hugh McCrimmon wept bitterly at the grave of the Glenelg laird, mourning not only the loss of a Highland clan chief laid to rest in foreign soil. The mournful, wind-carried music of McCrimmon's bagpipes was a farewell lament for the old Scotland. That day, on the wind-swept hills near Toulouse, the sorrowful wail of Hugh McCrimmon's pipes marked the passing of a true Highlander. Angus Ross was working in his garden when Hugh McCrimmon came to him. Skillfully wielding a hoe with his one remaining hand, the former soldier watched as his closest neighbour made his way across the valley. McCrimmon walked with the slow, weary gait of a troubled man, and there was no warmth in his greeting. "May the Lord bless you and yours, Angus." "The same to you, Hugh McCrimmon. But I've already paid my rent, and I doubt you've walked all the way across Glenmore just to wish me and my family well. I suppose you have something to say, and I don't think it's good news." Both men spoke in Gaelic, as did most who lived in the area. Pain flickered across McCrimmon's face, and he began cautiously. "You paid your rent to me, Angus, but dig a little deeper. I'm just a tenant myself." "Ah!" Angus Ross struck at the low green weeds with his hoe, as if nothing else mattered. "So Cameron has finally come for you as well. He's told you what we already know? We must leave the valley?" Hugh McCrimmon nodded, unable to bring himself to speak. The Rosses and McCrimmons had lived in Glenelg for generations, long before Cameron arrived years ago, and married the only daughter of the Glenelg clan chief. She had been a macrimon. How much time do we have? Weeding was now a futile task, yet the one-armed former soldier kept turning the soil with his hoe, though he no longer looked at what he was doing. By the new year, I'll be renting out only half the land I have now. He wants this part of the valley cleared by St. John's Day. That's when they start driving the sheep through. Angus let his hoe fall to the ground, staring at him in disbelief. By St. John's Day? That's only 6 weeks away. My crops won't even be half ripe by then. Cameron says he'll pay fair compensation. Fair? James Cameron doesn't know the meaning of the word. He'll offer 1/10 of what the harvest is worth, then find a reason to pay less than half of that. That's exactly what he did to Macleod of Glenbeg, and he treated Widow Matheson even worse. And what about my home? I have a family, a sick wife. Where am I supposed to take them? Cameron says he'll rent you a plot near Ardentoul. You can take the roof beams with you. Oh, really? Ross's voice was thick with both sarcasm and anger. He's crammed so many families into Ardentoul that there are more people than stones, and there are enough stones there to build an entire town. I told Cameron the same thing, Angus, but he listens to no one. He's set on clearing the land for sheep pasture. It seems the only way to pay off the debts his English wife has racked up, Angus said bitterly. A shame his father didn't come up with the same idea a few years earlier. Then he'd have had to lead a flock of sheep into battle at Toulouse, and I'd still have both hands to provide for my family. The young Cameron is not the man his father was, Hugh McCrimmon said. He hesitated for a moment before adding, I'm not a wealthy man, but I won't let your family starve, Angus. Thank you for that, Hugh, but you'll need money yourself. What happens if you can't pay the rent young Cameron demands? Hugh shrugged. I'll have to move south, or maybe sail for America. Damn James Cameron and that wife of his! Angus lifted his shovel only to drive it back into the earth. If I didn't have a family to think of, I'd thrash him myself, one hand or not. That won't change anything. Others have tried. The law is on Cameron's side. I'm sorry, Angus. Aye, of course, Hugh. We've seen better days, and our families have walked a long road side by side. We were both proud to serve the Camerons of Glenelg, but not this one. Greed, not pride in his people, drives James Cameron. Go and take a look at Ardentoul, Angus. Choose a plot and let me know when you're ready to move. I have a horse and cart you can use. Angus Ross nodded. I need to go and tell Elsa the news. She'll be upset. He gestured with a tilt of his head toward the wooden crosses and rough granite headstones, visible even from the far end of the valley, marking the graves in the Glenelg cemetery. Turning away so the tax collector wouldn't see the pain on his face, the red-haired, red-bearded man lowered his head and stepped through the low doorway of the thatched cottage that had been his home for so long. As Angus Ross led the horse, pulling McCrimmon's loudly creaking cart through Glenmore, a vast sea of sheep spread across the hills behind him. But Angus did not look back. There was no need for another trip. Everything the Ross family owned fit into the rattling cart, with room to spare for his wife. He would never return to this valley again. Elsa Ross lay at the edge of the cart, on a worn mattress stuffed with stiff, sweet-smelling heather. She had never been a strong woman, and each year it took her longer to recover from the hardships of the long Highland winters. Beside her, their 2 youngest daughters huddled together, the elder barely 2.5 years old. Both had been born after Angus returned from the war. For them, moving house and travelling by cart was nothing more than an adventure. Neither understood why no one else shared their joy. Elsa saw the sheep scattering across the steep slopes, taking over the land they had just left behind, and silently wept for a long time. She mourned all that was familiar, all they were leaving behind. What awaited them in the new place? She cried for her children, terrified of their future. But most of all, she wept for the man trudging warily ahead of the cart, leading the horse by the bridle, the man she had married. Angus Ross had inherited nothing but pride, fierce, hungry, and unyielding pride. It had driven him to enlist when he saw no other way to improve his family's circumstances. And once in the army, he was determined to rise quickly through the ranks. His father had reached the rank of sergeant major before his death, and Angus was set on achieving the same. A cannonball shattered his ambitions, but he returned from war with his pride intact. His hand had been sacrificed for the Cameron of Glenelg, and by tradition, bravery and wounds were repaid with land, a practice passed down through generations in the Northwest Highlands. But the new Cameron of Glenelg had not been raised in Highland tradition. Educated in Edinburgh, he had moved south and married an Englishwoman. Gratitude and duty meant nothing to him, and Angus had kept his tenancy only through the generosity of Hugh McCrimmon. The first thing James Cameron did as the head of the Glenelg clan was to evict the local tenants and lease the land to sheep farmers. For 3 years, McCrimmon and a few other principal tenants, who sublet their land, stood between the landlord and those he sought to remove, absorbing the rising rents. But Cameron grew greedier with time. The poor tenants began to leave, and if McCrimmon and the other leaseholders could not match the impossibly high rents offered by the sheep farmers, they too would soon be homeless. Elsa Ross lifted herself slightly, trying to catch a glimpse of her husband, but their belongings were piled high and unsteadily, blocking her view. Many things about their move to Ardentoul filled her with deep anxiety. They would be living on a small plot of land, surrounded by other dispossessed Highlanders. Her husband had a fiery temper and was not used to considering others. In Glenmore, they had no close neighbours, and the only person who ever bore the full weight of his anger was her, but she understood him. He was a good and caring man, but the shattering of all his hopes after losing his hand sometimes took its toll. How many hopes he had once placed in the army, but even that chance to escape poverty had been stolen by fate. Now, another man bearing the same name, Cameron, wanted to take away what little remained of his pride and independence. Almost 100,000 acres of Glenelg land had been cleared. Those who moved to Ardentoul tried to hold on to the Highland way of life. Others chose to remain in Glenelg, but few could afford to do so. Some, having lost their last shred of hope, headed south to the cities or even to England. And then there were the brave souls who boarded wooden-hulled ships, seeking fortune and a new life in Canada, America, Australia, or New Zealand. Angus built a new home for his family with the help of his neighbours. It was a simple structure with no windows and only one wall made of stone, while the others were coated with clay. The beams, brought from their old home, were laid with turf and rough reeds, weighed down with heavy stones to protect against the harsh winds blowing in from the Atlantic. Elsa Ross's heart nearly broke when she saw the structure called their new home for the first time, but she could not allow her husband to see her suffering. Instead, she calmly said, "This will suit us just fine," and lifting herself from her mattress, began directing where to place the furniture. He did not lose patience, even when the young sprouts blackened from the salty wind blowing in from the sea. He did not give up, even when the sheep roaming Ardentoul crossed the low walls surrounding his small patch of land, and ate what little of the crop the winds had spared. In response to his complaint, the owner of the sheep replied that he should have built taller walls. The sheep farmer had rented the pasture, and it was not his responsibility to build walls around any property near where the sheep grazed. Of course, the Glenelg Cameron had promised that there would be no dwellings nearby. The poor tenants and the sheep farmers were like fire and water. They could not coexist. The cow was the only possession Angus Ross had that set him somewhat above the other tenants, marking him as a man who had achieved a certain standing. That was when he made the firm decision that he must tell Glenelg Cameron about his hardships and demand compensation for his losses. He took with him 2 of his 3 sons, 18-year-old Murdo and Cathal, who was nearly 17. It was a 7-mile journey to Cameron's house. As the path climbed higher above Ardentoul, it offered a breathtaking view of the north and east of the Highlands. Far below, in the waters of Loch Alk, the sunlight was reflected, and its surface shimmered with a silvery glow that dazzled the eyes. And despite all his misfortunes, Angus Ross couldn't help but stop to take in the beauty and thank God for the gift of life. The father and his sons walked along the path that led past Watch Hill and then turned southeast. As Loch Alk turned into Loch Dhu, the path ran right along the water's edge. Here, the weather took a noticeable turn. Dark clouds drifted high above the mountains, The lake's waters darkened like lead, and the towering hills on either side seemed to press closer together. Perhaps it was an omen. In Rattigan, Angus learned that James Cameron was hosting guests from London, and that neither the host nor his visitors were early birds. Angus had no one to turn to with his troubles, but he said that he and his sons would wait. James Cameron emerged from his bedroom late in the morning, clearly in no hurry to meet with the poor tenant from Ardentall. It was only at noon that Angus Ross and his 2 sons were led through the corridors of the enormous house into a room large enough to fit 2 Ardentall cottages. James Cameron stood at the far end of the room with a glass of brandy in hand, chatting with his friends. Others in the room watched as 2 men leaned over a green baize-covered table, playing billiards. The game and all conversations fell silent as the Rosses entered. Angus wore the tartan kilt of the regiment led by Charles Cameron. His sons wore similar kilts, though in lighter grey tones. Each of them had a faded plaid draped over one shoulder. For the Londoners, it was their first time seeing real Highland Scots. Angus felt out of place in this lavish house, but no one would have guessed it as he walked through the grand room with his head held high, his sons following his example. Stopping a few steps away from the master of the house, Angus bowed his head, a gesture of respect to the Glenelg Cameron. "May the Lord bless you," Angus greeted the master of the house in the Gaelic dialect, as he had always greeted James Cameron's father. The greeting went unanswered. James Cameron did not speak Gaelic. However, as he glanced around the room, he was pleased to see the impression the visit of a real Highlander had made on his guests. It was an intriguing spectacle, but now he wanted the Rosses to leave as quickly as possible. They had brought with them the scent of peat smoke and manure, the smell of the floors in their home. If you love Scottish sagas, make sure to subscribe to my YouTube channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a new video.